Hi guys, this week we're going to continue quite nicely, I think, from last week's session to look at the social pressures on individuals. So, conformity we spent some time on last week, and we're going to continue that and look at another concept, that of de-individuation. So, as you can see from the picture here, the question we're going to confront is, do people really think for themselves, or are they sheep who blindly follow? Or is the truth maybe more nuanced? Is it somewhere in between? So let's have a look. The first point to make is that, as I think we showed last week, the social pressure to conform to the expected standards of behaviour and thought in the group, so called group norms, is a very, very powerful and very real thing. And the power of groups to influence individuals' behaviour is enormous. As we saw with Ash's experiments last week, you can get most people to completely change the way they think about something, even when the reality is pretty obviously what they thought in the first place. You can get them to change their opinion by using group pressure very effectively. So those conformity pressures are things we all feel because humans have evolved to conform to the group. Because when we think about it, when humans evolved and were living in caves, for instance, the best way to ensure survival was to band together with the group. If you were banished from the group, then you would probably die. It would probably be a death sentence. So that's a really, really strong driver of human behaviour. We don't like to be different from the group. It can be very uncomfortable, and it still is today, as shown by Burns' brain research that we looked at last week. So people have looked at these conformity pressures and tried to determine whether we can understand some of the great atrocities that masses of people have performed over the years by this conformity pressure. So looking at, for example, why some people followed Hitler, and many people did things that were absolutely appalling to fellow human beings. The same in Stalin's Russia, in the Cambodia of Pol Pot in the 1970s, where there was wholesale murder of large chunks of the population. How do we explain those terrible things? And that's something that social psychologists have spent a lot of time on. For example, after the Second World War, people looked to social psychology to try to explain the terrible things that the Nazis did. A bit later, they looked at them to try to explain the atrocities committed under Stalin. And, therefore, social psychology actually plays a very important social role. Because the obvious answer to why people do terrible things is to blame the individual, is to say, well, to do that, to put people into gas chambers, or to tell tales on people knowing they'll disappear and they'd never be seen again and sent to some slave camp, or to be complicit in the murder of whole classes of people, as happened in Cambodia, you'd have to be some kind of evil monster, some kind of sicko. And that's not a very satisfying answer, because these atrocities involved so many people, involved such a large proportion of the population, that to believe that means to believe that effectively, a large proportion of the population are psychopaths. And we know that just isn't true, that can't really explain that only a very small proportion of the population are actually psychopathic in nature, have no empathy towards others, and therefore will do things to hurt them. if it's, to their advantage. We know only a small proportion of people are that way. So if that's true, how can we explain these terrible things? How can we explain the fact that not only did the Nazis commit terrible, terrible crimes, but one of the hardest things to face about the murder of millions and millions of people in concentration camps was that such a large proportion of the population seemed to enthusiastically take part in this? Well, maybe the answer could lie in our tendency towards obedience to authority. Okay? That maybe social psychologists have a more satisfying answer than putting the blame on all the individuals involved. Maybe the situation, and in particular the human instinct to be obedient to authority figures, might play a really, really big role. And by the way, you might be wondering at this stage what on earth this has to do with sport, but don't worry, we will certainly get there as well, because there are clearly big examples of the influence of this in sport as well. Now, one of the most famous names in this whole area is that of a chap called Stanley Milgram, who performed some very famous experiments way back in the 1960s, where people were asked to take part in an experiment that they were told was examining different learning and teaching strategies at Harvard University, a very prestigious university in the US. And they were asked to give people electric shocks when they gave incorrect answers to questions to see how it impacted their learning and performance. Now, the interesting point here is that 2/3 of people administered the highest level of shock to the person when they kept getting the answer wrong, despite the fact that the participant was apparently in a great deal of pain. The participants, I should add here, were just actors. They weren't really getting electric shocks, but the person was told that when they pressed this button, it would give the person a shock, and the person would then tend to scream. So 2/3 of people kept doing it, even to a level which they'd previously been told could cause serious harm to the participant. And again, people were very, very shocked by these findings and latched onto them to try to explain some of the atrocities that we've mentioned before. Milgram suggested that what's happening here is that people are socialized from a very early age into being obedient to authority figures to serve a larger social purpose. In this case, the experiment was apparently organized by an authority figure, a professor at Harvard, rather I should say Yale University, pardon me, and therefore this was an authority figure, and people thought, well, they must know what they're doing. This is all right. This is something that's helping society by helping us understand ways to learn and improve performance, and therefore took part in it, even when it was quite obvious they were causing pain to another human being. Now, as with Asch's work, this has been replicated many, many times with similar findings, that a large proportion of people in the US and UK seem to be willing to hurt others in the cause of science, apparently. Now, when you ask people whether they would hurt others, the vast majority of people are horrified by that thought and say, no, there's no way I'd do it. But all the evidence points in the opposite direction, that actually if you press the right buttons in people, they will do some pretty awful things to other people. There's a number of factors that influence the likelihood of them doing that. One thing, for example, is surveillance. So in Milgram's experiment, when the professor was actually watching the person giving the shocks, they were more likely to do it than when the professor wasn't present. We also know that the further away physically that the person was from the person getting the shocks, the more likely they were to do it. And that speaks to the idea of what are called buffers. So, for example, if you don't immediately see the results of your actions, you're more likely to do them if they're hurting others. So it's much easier, for instance, to press a button that gives somebody that you can't see a fatal electric shock than it is to stand right next to someone, point a gun at them, and shoot them. Now, another important factor is social norms. So, for instance, we know that where the social norms are that individuals are obedient to authority and do what authorities say, then these kind of activities are much more likely to happen. So in this case, because the experiment was for a very prestigious university, and the social norm would normally be to help with experiments that are going to help humanity, people tend to have gone along with it. Another important factor is ideological justification. So if people can justify hurting others by saying, well, I'm actually helping humanity, even though it's hurting that one individual, then they're more likely to do it, in the same way that the behaviours of the Nazis and of Stalin and of the killing fields of Cambodia were all justified by ideology. So once you come to believe in something and believe the end justifies the means, you're far more likely to do it. So this probably all sounds very negative and very dark, but there are some bright spots to point out. The first point is that the idea of passive conformity, the idea that people are just sheep, is probably a great oversimplification, and it's doing people a great disservice. Actually, the willingness to follow authorities, to be obedient, seems to depend on identification with that authority. If people can't identify with that cause, then they're much less likely to do it, and they have to believe that it's right. So, for example, the German people were whipped up into performing those awful behaviours during the war by a leader who aroused in them a feeling that they'd been really unfairly treated after the First World War by the victors. So they believed they had right on their side, they had a moral right, and that made them much more vulnerable to being exploited to perform these really terrible things. So it's not simple that, everybody just behaves like a sheep. It does depend on a number of different things. But the research does show that obedience seems to be something, again, like conformity, that's ingrained in the human psyche. And we can see this in sport, in fact, as well as in many, many other situations. And a classic example of it relates to one of the greatest basketball players of all time, a man called Wilt Chamberlain. Now, it would take me a very long time to list every NBA record that Wilt Chamberlain still holds, even though his career ended in 1973. Many, many years before any of you were born, because there are 71 records that Chamberlain still holds. He's one of the greatest players of all time. Okay? And he was tremendous. As I say, he set many, many records, including being the only person ever to have averaged more than 40 points a game over a season, and having the highest score in history when he scored over 100 points in a match in 1962. So an amazing performer, but he did actually have a weakness, that he was really, really rubbish at doing free throws. And given that free throws are a massively important part of basketball, this was definitely something of a problem. And after a couple of seasons of scoring only around 50%, which for an elite performer like him was really, really bad, he did something quite drastic. He started throwing the ball underhand. Now, for those of you who don't know much about basketball, it might come as a surprise that players are even allowed to throw underhand with a free throw, because when you watch them on TV or even watch local games, nobody ever does that. But it is perfectly legal to do it, and interestingly, it's much easier than throwing overhand. Okay? When he did that, that was the only season when Chamberlain took his free throw conversion rate above 60%. Okay? That season he did that was also the season when he averaged his highest ever, over 50 points a game, and he also shot during one game 28 successful free throws, another record that's never been beaten since. So this was somebody who was terrible at free throws, and yet still holds the record for the biggest number of free throws during a match, because he did something very, very different to what everybody else had done. But then he went back the next season, despite breaking these records, to shooting free throws the more traditional overhand way. And you might think, why? Given how well he'd done throwing underhand and how poorly his overhand throw was, and what happened? His success percentage plummeted. Okay, falling as low in one subsequent season as 38%. But he never shot underhand free throws again. At the same time, while setting records in every other aspect of his game. Now, the main reason for that, apparently, was he couldn't take the stigma and the constant ribbing and criticism he got for throwing underhand, because in basketball that's often called the, in quotes, granny shot. So it's really looked down on because it lacks any kind of machismo. It's seen as, you know, a really, really unmasculine and unpro sports person way to perform the shot. And so he stopped, even though this was really effective. And this is a professional athlete who you would think would do whatever's effective, even if other people mock him or whatever. He didn't. He couldn't withstand that and went back to conforming. Now, of course, that's not unusual, because hardly anybody else has ever thrown underhand in pro basketball either, despite the fact that it's very easy to demonstrate that that is a much easier way, and you'll likely get a higher percentage throwing underhand than overhand. Okay? Now, interestingly, at the same time Chamberlain was setting his records, the player with the highest free throw percentage in history, Rick Barry, was the only NBA player who's ever thrown underhand the whole time. He had a success rate of 90% in all free throws he ever took, which at the time was a world record, and since has only been bettered by 3 other players in 40 years. Okay? And guess what? He threw underhand as well. Okay? And so it shows that even when something is successful, other people won't copy it if it's not conforming to the norm. It's very, very hard to do that. Today, interestingly, there's only 2 NBA players that take free throws underhand, and one is Rick Barry's son, interestingly enough, and the other is another performer who was performing so badly at his free throws, a player, Chinanu Onuaku, who was performing so poorly that he figured he had absolutely nothing to lose. Okay? So, therefore, even athletes who you might think would do everything to perform their best are victim of conformity pressures and do things because other people do it, not because it's the best thing to do. So when you're thinking about your own training, your own routines, your own way of doing things in your sport, ask yourself if that is really the best way to do it, or you're just doing it, you're just training like that or performing like that because it's what everybody else does. So therefore, conformity pressures are really big in sport as in other walks of life as well. But another important issue we need to think about when we think of social pressure is something called de-individuation. Okay, and de-individuation is an idea that goes back a long way. A chap called Gustave Le Bon in the 19th century did a lot of research on the behaviour of crowds. And his view was that crowds tend to behave much worse than individuals, that when aggressive behaviour starts in crowds, it tends to be contagious, and crowds commit destructive acts that individuals wouldn't commit on their own. And he looked at a number of examples of this, of riots, for example, that occurred in major cities across Europe. And of course, these kind of things still happen. So this picture was taken of a burning bus during the London riots a few years ago. So could Le Bon's ideas be still relevant? And according to one of the most famous of all living psychologists, Philip Zimbardo, Le Bon's ideas had a lot to them and can probably explain a lot of the really bad mob behaviour that we see. So his idea was very similar, one of what's called de-individuation, and this is a feeling that the individual has lost their personal identity and that it becomes merged into the group and means they're much more likely to perform impulsive behaviours that they would never perform when they're on their own, such as behaving badly in a group when rioting, or for instance when you see a group of people misbehaving, say on public transport, and you might ask yourself, well, would they really do that if they were on their own? Well, probably not, and that basically is what de-individuation is. And Zimbardo argued that de-individuation leads to more aggressive behaviour. A very famous study done by Ed Diener in the 70s found that when people were assured of anonymity, they performed much more antisocial behaviour than they did when they weren't. Now, you might be thinking, well, what on earth has this got to do with sport? But again, in groups, in teams, we might be more likely to perform, for instance, aggressive behaviours to help the team than we would do if we were performing on our own. De-individuation is often used to explain the behaviour of mobs. So, for example, in the UK riots of 2011 that I mentioned, psychologists often used that term and talked about it in the kind of post-mortems that occurred on TV afterwards. Findings on this have been quite mixed, so there is some support for the idea, but then what we don't know about so much is why sometimes people in mobs don't always fall in with the group and join in with these behaviours. So there seem to be individual difference factors that are important and probably need more research. One really interesting recent finding is the relationship between unethical behaviour and anonymity, such that so when people are, for example, performing certain behaviours via social media, such as criticism, they're likely to say things that they would never say to somebody's face. So that kind of anonymity, that kind of keyboard warrior status that people have hiding behind their keyboards, means they'll say and do things that they'd never do if they were up close next to somebody. But again, there's also that buffer which is important as well. So with football fans, for example, you'll see opposing fans who are segregated in matches shout abuse at each other for 90 minutes. But if they were next to those people in the street, it's very unlikely they would shout that abuse at them, because there's that buffer in place that we've talked about before when we talked about obedience and conformity.